let's just talk about the importance of breaking the code of silence. First, what is the code of silence? What does that even mean coming from you as law enforcement, former law enforcement?
Well, yeah. I don't just come from law enforcement. I grew up in the neighborhood, and so it was even strong when I grew up. Is the sense that you do not give information on somebody in the neighborhood, regardless of how heinous of a crime they did. Like, for example, this last weekend, killing 6 people and shooting numerous others. You know, at times there's really strong influences not to give information on other people in your neighborhood. And what's interesting is people often do if there's incentives, lesser sentence on their crime or funding from the government to pay people to talk. But it's legitimate in neighborhoods that it's reinforced by influences in the neighborhood, like violence. If you are seen giving information to the police department, there could be violence upon you or your family or something like that. But we really need to have it mean that when you are protecting your neighborhood, that's protecting your neighborhood against all threats. So if somebody is killed in your neighborhood, that's not good for you or your neighborhood. So providing information, but in a manner that will keep you safe, is really critical.
If you see something, should you say something? If you have information, should you work with and partner with law enforcement to inform them of it?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, especially under the context in which we're having this conversation. But I think that's a very difficult one, right? Because you have cases where, for example, 2 years ago, we had 2 young men that were shot and killed at Arden Fair Mall. And there was information that had been shared in the community that led to the arrest of the shooter. For the family, that was very critical, but how was that perceived in our communities every day? Because there is a social indoctrination of quote unquote snitching and our relationship with law enforcement, and not just the concerns of retaliations within the community, but also there's a deeply rooted sense of distrust with law enforcement. And that law enforcement is not going to protect you, and different things of that nature. And so when it comes to the sharing of information, it depends on where that information is coming from, who's giving that information, how it is conveyed. But in the context of this conversation, in regards to a mass shooting that happened in a very public way, I'm certain that there are people who have video footage, whether it be cell phone, people on social media. It was in a business area where there are video cameras and things of that nature. And so I think that the collection of the information is going to come from a variety of places.
I go back to the original portion of the question when you mentioned breaking the code of silence. And so listening to Chief and Jamelia and understanding that when you talk about breaking the code of silence for anything, there's a process. And you have to have faith and trust in the process, but there's always a process. And you don't start from the outside in, you start from the inside out. And so what's at the core of this is the communities don't trust the process of providing that type of information because they don't see the people who are responsible for their circumstances being held accountable or can carry themselves in the same manner. Who are the people who are providing information when politicians are stealing funds from communities that need the money? And if we can see, or where are the people in law enforcement that are telling on other law enforcement? And if you ask people in the community to do that, but they don't see those who are asking them to do it, doing it in their own environment, that's a hard sell. So I think it's a process and a discussion on axiological revolution discussion of our values and how people adopt their values needs to take place before you just go to people in those communities and ask them to provide information. That's the conversation that I think needs to take place.
How do law enforcement go about building trust within our communities so that when tragedies like this strike, there can be some sort of partnership?
Well, I think you've seen throughout time that certain people in law enforcement have a tremendous amount of trust in our neighborhood. So, for example, if you go to the community and you say, do you trust Officer Johnson, for example, they might say, yes, I love Officer Johnson. I trust him with my life. But then if you ask them that same person, do you trust the police department that Officer Johnson works with, those same people will say no. So we have to take that same concept and ask yourself, why do they trust Officer Johnson? And most likely it's because they have a history with Officer Johnson. They've gone through some things, they've known him or her over time, and they've experienced some stuff. And Officer Johnson has stayed true to, he has the job to do, but he has built a level of trust with people where they can see his heart is true and all those sort of things. So we have to carry that same kind of thinking over to the organization as a whole. So if somebody is wearing that patch, they automatically trust you. You have to lose that trust for them not to trust you. And so that's going to take a lot of work because there's a lot of history behind law enforcement and community. And we have to actually start working on that. We can't just go, we had a crime yesterday, we need to solve this, without the long-term approach to how do we build these relationships, build a better trust. So these beliefs of snitching and not snitching are never able to take root the way they have because there's too much trust built up.
How can people be reassured that when they are giving in these tips, when they are helping law enforcement, that they themselves are going to remain safe, that they don't have to worry about retaliation from wherever it might come? Because again, there is also a fear of helping and working with law enforcement.
Yeah, I would say the first thing is if there's somebody you trust, whether it's in law enforcement or anywhere else that you can give the information to, that would probably make you feel much safer. I have, over my career, I've had many people call me and go, look, you didn't hear from me, but here's some information. And a lot of times we have a little bit of information that we might not think is very significant, and it might be the one piece that will lead us to everything else. So I'd say first, if there is an individual that you trust, provide that information to that individual. But there's other ways you can do it where you remain anonymous. So law enforcement doesn't even know who gave them the information. So if you are concerned, which some people are, that I know law enforcement says they'll keep it confidential, but I don't necessarily trust that because I have a lot to lose if they don't. Well, you can provide information and law enforcement doesn't even know who you are.
I think the one thing that I would like for the community to know, and the community I'm about to speak to, is our government officials. To kind of piggyback off what Samuel said, you know, when we talk about the sharing of information, when we talk about accountability, transparency, we throw these words around very loosely and they mean something different to everyone. But when we are talking about systemic change, we must talk about it from the top down. And so if you want communities to be able to share certain information, irregardless, you're going to have to be able to share that same information. Building trust is a two-way street. And to continue to go to the communities that lack the trust based on very real systemic issues in history, I think it's unfair and it puts an unnecessary burden on that community. At the same time, there is a sense of the community needing to be able to help provide safety for itself. And what does that look like? And we know that historically that is not with a relationship with law enforcement. And so I think that, you know, it's time that we do have those deeper conversations about what our value systems are, about the way that, you know, we're operating like hamsters on the wheel, and that we continue to do the same things expecting a different response.
I agree with Jamelia wholeheartedly that the discussion that has to take place is one that talks about values, and not just in the inner city community, you know, inner cities, in the communities within the inner city, but also within the organizations that are directly connected to them, you know, that govern the inner city, that are responsible for the resources that make their way into the inner city or do not make the resources, because people are not blind. People are not deaf, dumb, or stupid. And it's quite the responsibility to ask us to walk a road that you yourself are not willing to walk. And we risk life and limb and the possibility of anything else that may come along with it. You know, so in order for this discussion to really have some teeth and really have some meaning, we would have to see the same level of accountability above the inner city.
Well, I think it goes to everything that Sam and Jamila also said is we far too often break this down into a single solution or single issue thing. So like right now, we need information to solve this crime. As opposed to, well, that does need to happen. We do need to solve this crime. We do need to hold people accountable for this. But at the same time, we also need to address, how did this happen in the first place? How did somebody come to resolve their issues with shooting dozens and dozens of rounds in a crowded place? How did our communities get the way they are today and have stayed that way for so many years, that are really like breeding grounds to put more people into criminal behavior or to foster that? And we need to work on things long term that change our neighborhoods, provide better opportunities, and lift all people up in our communities. And that only comes from working together, understanding each other, and collaborating. So, in times like this, you hear we either need a lot more law enforcement, or we need to cut law enforcement out completely and put social workers in, or community organization. Neither of those extremes are correct. We all need to work together, because today we might need a social worker for this young man, but tomorrow somebody does something, there needs to be some accountability and a social worker and a community person that they feel comfortable with. We all need to stop dividing each other and start working together and changing the things that need to be changed. There are things that need to be changed in law enforcement, but if all we're talking about is eliminating law enforcement or adding to the same old law enforcement, we're missing the picture. And we never get to the actual changes that need to take place. Yeah, so when we, often the conversation is about snitching, not snitching. And I agree we should really change that term, because what it really is if somebody is a danger to our community, that needs to be handled. There needs to be accountability, and hopefully there needs to be some assistance so that person is no longer a threat to our community. So when we say you're helping law enforcement by providing information on somebody that has just murdered 6 people, to me, you're not helping law enforcement, you're helping your community. You're helping you and your community remain safe. And the police department is a vehicle of how it gets there. But to the many of the points that brought up today, if you don't trust that vehicle, then you're not going to use it. And so we need to build the trust. But the reality of what we all should be doing, the goal for all of us, the police department, the community members, the community organization, other governmental entities, our political leaders, what we all should, the goal for all of us should be, is to lift up all of our communities and ensure that all of our communities are safe and thriving. That should be all of our goal. We should be united on that.
And so, speaking from the theory of emotional illiteracy-based criminality, right, which holds that no one is born bad, no one is born evil. People adopt criminality as a coping mechanism for unprocessed traumas. And so when you look at a mass shooting or any type of violence in our communities, we're talking about a person that was probably already a casualty or a trauma before they made somebody else a casualty. And there's some healing that needs to take place there. Hurt people, right? So when we see these type of hurt taking place in the community, instead of just asking people to, quote unquote, snitch, as if that's the answer to the problems, we need to start taking on approaches that are trauma informed and looking at how can we deal with criminality from a more humanistic perspective instead of just looking for punitive measures. Because all the community hears right now is give us their name so we can punish them, But anybody who could shoot a number of people in a mass situation is somebody that's deeply hurt, and dealing with severe traumas. And that's the larger discussion here about healing the communities and healing the people within the communities. And just, giving up information is only one part of it. Inside these communities, we need to decide what is it that we value. Is a elderly lady's life important? Is a child's life important? Is anybody's life important? Do we condone people just being, slaughtered and murdered and killed for no good reason? Is that something that we stand for? If not, then you need to have a real discussion with yourself and ask yourself, Are you comfortable with that type of, lifestyle and being a part of that? These are the type of questions and decisions and that need to take place and discussions that we need to have. It's about healing on a larger scale. It's more than just providing information. That's only one part of it, Candace.
So my last comment would be to the government officials and politicians that are looking at this, that this will be old news in a week because they really don't want to be talking about this, from the governor's office to the mayor's office to the district attorney's office. Let's not continue to politicize these types of human tragedies. Let's actually get to the root of what's happening and address the communities and from a humanistic, holistic approach, so that we can stop having these conversations, so that people can stop losing their lives, so that people can stop taking their pain and exercising it on others.